So publishing, every week you read about how publishing is changing and how significant the self-publishing revolution is and what kind of problems that publishers are having when they need to transition to digital and sell ebooks. And that's really only accelerated since around 2006 when the Kindle came out. If you even go back 10 years ago, we're looking at maybe a tenth of the number of books sold in America were actually being printed. So it's increased tenfold since then. But yeah, it used to be you really didn't have any power as a writer. Regardless of whether the current empowerment is good or bad, I'm sure we'll talk about that. Right. But yeah.
I was going to hit our first slide here because this is basically the way it was. We had gatekeepers. The gatekeepers are the ones that let you in if you were an artist and gave you the chance to be rich and or famous and or seen in the world. And if you didn't pass the gatekeepers, it wasn't going to work. So here I have, of course, Paramount Pictures to talk about the big studio world of film. And then that guy at the bottom there, you may not know his picture, but that is Clive Davis of Arista Records, who was one of the record industry moguls, maybe the biggest mogul in the history of moguls. And then Simon & Schuster, which, by the way, this you may not know, that is Simon & Schuster. Now imagine that guy on the left making the decisions about what you get to read.
Right.
So that is the way things were. At any rate.
Anyway.
And you were and also we had auteurs who they weren't just anybody in the crowd. They were someone who was elevated to a position of we appreciate what this person does and we follow what they do. So the industry was driven even as recently as 10 or 15 years ago by big name artists rather than necessarily it's now dispersed a little bit more. That's one thing that's definitely changed.
Absolutely. So, and this is an interesting photo. This is actually El Ateneo. It's the most famous bookstore in Buenos Aires. I was actually there this summer and took this picture, and it's an old theater that's been converted to a bookstore. There's a lot of support internationally for bookstores. Usually they're subsidized in some way by the government, which is why we're left with a few big box chain stores, but most other countries still have smaller independent stores that stay in business. So the way things were.
All right, well, how are things, let's talk about the way things are right now before we get into maybe the future of it.
Right.
Let's talk about the books for a second. Let's talk about what is happening now compared to then.
Okay.
Because I imagine the bookstores like that are not going to be around much longer.
Right. Well, there are a couple really disruptive things going on in publishing. Obviously, the money invested in individual authors has dropped significantly. The advances are quite a bit smaller. But the number of books being published has skyrocketed, as I mentioned before, by tenfold. And the playing field's also been leveled considerably. So you really don't need to go through an agent if you don't want to. Things like Author Solutions and Smashwords are really moving millions of books that people are writing by themselves. Now, that may not always be a good thing because the world invented editors for a reason, and usually your work is better if someone does read it through and help you fix it up. But the power to distribute your own work is really changing the landscape quite a bit. Beyond distribution and the ability to skip the agent, I'd also talk a little bit about authors developing communities. There's a lot of a burden on individual authors at this point because it does come out of their pocket to cultivate a community, a fan base. But on the other hand, that can also really drive sales, right? So if you can master that ability to reach out individually to your fans through a blog, your Twitter, your Facebook, however you're promoting your work, you can really get a significantly devoted readership. It may be a little more niche, but it's better to have one person that buys all your books than 20 people where they're just not sure who you are. So it's really a powerful thing to be able to cultivate your own community.
Yeah. Now, unfortunately, in the movie and music business, the biggest change is just that there's less money being spent for it. I'm of the opinion that, having been in the music business and seen the advent of not just MP3s, but just the whole structure of the way people got paid and the willingness of consumers to spend money for music, and seeing that decline, I got out of being in the record business, and I got out of making records, and I got into filmmaking because I felt that there was still an opportunity with independent filmmaking to have some successes with it and not go down with the ship, as it were. However, the thing is, the movie business is in exactly the same kind of cycle that the record business was in. It's just hasn't progressed as far down the hole. Oops, went the wrong way there. So at any rate, here's an example of what's happening now. You can have independent movies. 10 years ago, you had to spend $8 million to get a movie that had as much success as an independent movie can have, basically, with Academy Awards and so on and so forth. After 5 years of release, after paying the investors back and so on and so forth, the producers made, four producers split $300,000. So it was quite a big of investment at the beginning, but yet people were spending $8 million on a movie. Now people spend $100,000, $150,000, $250,000 at the absolute maximum, unless you've got stars. And there are people like this wonderful piece of art, Strippers versus Werewolves.
Only the finest.
Where the budget was around $400. And after they paid back the investors and paid for the expenses of distributing it on the internet and getting it on Netflix and so on, they made in less than a year $15,000. So in effect, even though it's not quite the artistic success, it's at least on some level of financial success for somebody. But in an industry where most people don't make any money back on their film, $15,000 is nothing to sneeze at.
Right, absolutely.
And to see the way things have changed, this is Lars von Trier's two movies. In the year 2000, he sold Dancer in the Dark for $120 million. 10 years later, he sold Antichrist, a similar movie, similar kind of critical acclaim and so on, for $1.5 million. So this is an example of just the fact that even among the bigger art house films and the bigger, even among bigger films, people are not spending as much money to see things that aren't blockbuster animated films and so on.
And one of the interesting things about where the money's being made, the price of ebooks, I don't want to get too into it because it's kind of a complicated issue, but one of the things that Amazon did was decide that all ebooks should really be $9.99. And to do that, they actually took a loss on a number of their books because the rest of Amazon could sell toasters and weather that loss, and they could undercut everybody else. But what that's done is it's served to drive the price of all ebooks down. And as of last week, the average price for an ebook was $6.93. So in some ways, the author's making more money because they've cut out the middleman if they're self-publishing. But on the other hand, there's less money being spent on that book. It's interesting to see where that goes.
Yeah, I think that was the theme basically in music business, is that the big artists are still selling more records than smaller artists, and they're still making a considerable amount of money, but they're not making as much as they used to. The small artists at the very, very bottom are maybe doing a little better because they have some more access. The artists in the middle are frequently getting squeezed out. So these are people in the record business who were playing club tours around the U.S. and Europe, and are releasing independent releases that sold maybe 25,000, 35,000 copies, and they were making enough to keep going. That's become a more difficult prospect because people aren't using the traditional methods to buy physical records, and they're not necessarily paying iTunes to download them either.
Right.
I'm not sure where it is next. May I?
Yeah.
So this is Steven Soderbergh, the film director. He recently gave a speech about the state of cinema. And
that was just last week or this week.
See, we are so on top of it. And the thing about Soderbergh's speech that stood out to me was he talked about the death of cinema. And his opinion is what's missing, what's the missing ingredient in big budget Hollywood films is they won't even consider doing a film that's not a blockbuster, an action movie.
Right.
Maybe if it has gigantic star power, but even a director like Soderbergh can't make a film just because he thinks it's going to be a good film.
Right.
And that opens up a possibility for something new, which is the smaller independent films have an opportunity to make films that guys like Soderbergh and Tarantino used to make, and to do them on a smaller scale for a lower budget, but to fill the need that audiences have. I think people are interested in seeing those movies, and if the big players won't make it, it's an opportunity.
Right. And I think that
Books are like that, I'm sure, too.
And Soderbergh's done some interesting things, right? He does the simultaneous release from time to time where he'll do the DVD and the theater at the same time, and all kinds of experimental, kind of empowering creator type stuff.
He's a more futuristic and cutting edge thinker than you would think for a
Yes.
major Hollywood player.
Right. I don't know if he wants to be called a major Hollywood player, actually. Bite your tongue. I would like to talk about obscurity for a minute. I'm not sure where we are in the slide deck, but one of the things that I think is, it's something that most people don't think about is book discovery. The way you used to find books is either a friend would recommend it to you, or you'd walk into a store and there's that new book table and that's where you start. But book discovery becomes increasingly complex when you're trying to buy through a website. How do you get someone's attention? How do you market to people when every book in the online store is, this tiny little book cover? And Amazon's solution has always been a recommendation engine at the bottom. If you're on the Goodreads website, that's the sort of thing they try to do, recommend new books. But obscurity, with the increasing number of books being created, is the problem to solve now. It's not so much, can you get a book made? Yeah. You can get a book made and you can put it out there, and for a couple $100 you can have someone design a cover and edit parts of it and release it. It's really not that expensive. But the obscurity, languishing in obscurity, is the big problem. A lot of self-published books only sell 70 copies. And if half of those are to your friends, then, wow, you've written a book, but have you changed the world? So it's still something that you need to conquer. It's not just about getting past the gatekeepers, really. I think when you look at the different services out there, there's actually a startup called Riffle that's just like 2 blocks from here, and they're creating a book discovery service to try to solve that problem, I think. And there's actually a hackathon May 18th for publishing startups to try to solve that problem. So I think that'll be part of it. But one of the things that I've personally focused on are solutions that exist inside content to add social features and discussion features. And that's not something that comes either from the author or from the publishing industry, but something that adds a layer of value on the thing. So I don't want to talk too much about what I'm doing, but I think that there are things about technology when we can focus on book discussion and finding new ways to discover books that will kind of solve that obscurity problem. Sure. I hope.
I was going to address this later as it relates to the future for artists, not just writers, but also it's the same issue for now that there's a sea of people. Your ways to stand out in the sea are, I think, it's more difficult for you to drive that you stand out, and more is something that you build in your audience. So in theory, having an audience who tells you about the things that they like and introduces their friends is a more powerful thing. So it's the whole idea of you find that 10 people that really believe in you, and you get them each to tell 10 people, or you find 100 people to do the same with another 100 people, or 1,000 people. That's your army, and those people tell their 1,000 people, and they're a trusted source for those 1,000 people. Whereas if I try to send to 100,000 people the mailing, their chances of actually responding to anything that I say is pretty slim. No matter if it was the most brilliant thing in the world, it's spam to them.
Right.
So I think that's one thing, and I think we don't do enough recommending things that really mean something to us in art to other people that we know.
Well, the most common place people say they find out about which book to read next, the most successful place is usually Twitter, oddly enough. And most people aren't marketing their books through Twitter, but most people like to announce what they're reading. So I think that's pretty interesting. There's one other point I'd like to bring up. I have no idea where we are on time.
Question.
Yeah.
There's a social question.
Of course, go ahead.
There's a social media question. I like to keep it interactive and keep it going in that space too. So along the lines of what you're doing, Travis, I'm pretty fascinated at what you're actually doing, and so are a bunch of people online. They want you to tell them the short and sweet of what Read Social is, so they can can learn and explore what you're trying to do with that.
Okay. Read Social is an attempt to create book groups across different book services, so you can actually have a conversation inside the book. So it's something that publishers and developers can install, and it allows people to attach comments to paragraphs inside the book and respond, attach images. And then it also uses hashtags to create groups of ideas. So it adds like a layer of conversation that lives on top of the book, inside the content, and if you change the hashtag, it changes the conversation.
Interesting. I wonder how that would apply to movies. You could have a track of text, subtitles,
right. Well,
that are social commentary.
YouTube does have annotations enabled. A little more complicated with video, but in terms of distraction factor versus how do you integrate it. But yeah.
It becomes pop-up video after a while. It's like, I remember this guy when he was in a commercial.
Right, right. But I would add to that, one of the interesting things, my brother. My brother's an independent filmmaker, David Schmoody, and I was telling him that we were going to be giving this presentation, and his comment about the social factors that play into film and writing was that you really need to integrate that with your process, because once it's your job to own that promotion and own that community as a content creator, you need to try to find a way the entire time you're creating your work to share that, to try to build that community. And that's really changes kind of the way you think about creating your own product, right? Project, art, whatever you want to call it, yeah.
I mean, I think we build connection in social media first. That you start by making, someone has a response, a personal response to your art, and then you're able to pull that person and hopefully identify them, and we'll get into that in a second with the giving away your work for free and how that builds these relationships.
Right.
But I feel like it starts with how you present yourself and your work when you're personally dealing with people, when you're dealing with them as a human being, as opposed to notes on a keyboard. Not to say that this is a bad idea, social networking, because I know that's the entire focus of your business. But I have no idea where we are on slides. We're going to have random images with something good. Let's see. That was something we talked about before. By the way, these 6 people, and I use the term advisedly, have written basically half of the #1 songs in the last 5 years. In 1986, in 1 year, there were 31 #1 songs by 29 different people, so it's become consolidated. So just when you think that there's more access for people who should be achieving audiences, that's not necessarily the case. Anyway, that was my point. Let's talk about Kickstarter for a second.
Oh yeah, Kickstarter is really big with books, both paper books and digital books, and that's been kind of a surprise for me, because that wasn't what I pictured when I first heard about Kickstarter. There's, I don't know if we have a slide for it, but the Steampunk Homes book that came out. One of the, here, this is, I could talk about this book a bit as well. So I don't know if anyone here has heard of Amanda Hawking. She writes paranormal romance fiction for young adults. And she has made $2 million in the last 2 years, and she's like 23 years old. So she's one of the success stories, and you say, okay, well, why is she a success story? Because what she's writing is, in my own personal opinion, not really fine literature. But there are a couple things that she's done to create that her position there. First of all, she's genre fiction. So if you're writing romance or if you're writing vampire novels, this series is, as you might be able to guess, a series about vampires. Those people tend to buy multiple books in that vein. They read really aggressively, so they're buying books every week. And the other thing she did was she priced her books from 99 cents to $2.99. Which means she has sold a ton of books, right? If she's made $2 million. But the old school publishers, the big 6, now the big 5, are coming to her. And they signed a deal with her because the one place she couldn't get actually was paper bookstores, because you actually need a distribution network to do that and to sell print. But she's retained a lot of her digital rights, so she will probably continue to make that much money. So she didn't go through Kickstarter, but with the project I was thinking of is called Steampunk Homes, and it's it's this one actually. They were looking for I don't know how much money they were looking for, 10 grand or something. They were going to make an iPad app that's this interactive piece. It's a book, but it's also got video. It's enhanced ebook, basically. And they got over 50 grand. And they were able to crowdsource it because it's an interesting concept. It's also really well done, and it's one of the more successful, I think, projects on Kickstarter.
I mean, the thing, just to touch on the Kickstarter for a second, it's definitely created some access. It's sort of like an early adopters thing, though. It feels like the people who got in early, who knew what they were doing, who it was a new thing, and people were interested in participating in it more, were very successful. And since then, it's become a little less successful in terms of people getting funded, and also it's hard to duplicate. By the time you've seen the 50,000 singer-songwriter who would like to make a record, it's a little different than the first one you saw, right?
It's the obscurity problem again, right? You start to blend in.
Sure, and you can. It's the same market issues over and over again,
right.
Unfortunately, but it is a way of building a very loyal that 1,000-person army that people have found. You get into this is talking about something else, but here we'll skip ahead. Amanda Palmer, of course, famous story. She was able to raise $1.1 million. But her primary argument for why this works is that she built this army of people that really wanted to help her. Instead of her making people help her, she decided to let them help and have them become part of it. So they're people that bring food to the shows, that get to participate in the shows, and so on and so forth. So it's this is definitely sort of a futuristic way of looking at it. And just one more I wanted to hit here. Oh, by the way, the first strippers.
We now know what Will watches.
Apparently, the strippers versus werewolf. This got mixed up a little bit. That's not bad enough. That bred strippers versus zombies, and then of course the ultimate zombie strippers. So this fellow, Derek Webb, just quickly want to touch on him. He gives away all of his music, does not charge anybody to download music. And he was asked in an interview why he does this and how it works for him. And he said, if I make a sale on iTunes, maybe $10 for an album, one time for a person, I don't know who that person is. I have no connection with them. They may never come back again, even if they like the record. They may not come to a show. I have no way to reach them.
Right.
He said, however, if I give that album for free in exchange for their email and Twitter and their contact information, then they become somebody that I talk with regularly and I can market to directly, who will come to shows, who will buy merchandise. They'll pay a $10 ticket price to get in the show, plus $10 of merchandise to get, on occasion. He said I end up making an average of, $10 to $15 from every person that I give a record away to free.
Huh.
And they were more invested in a certain way because they, instead of just buying a product on the shelf, they invested in the person in a certain way.
Right. Interesting.
So
I don't have anything to add to that. What's the next slide?
I think we're like to the point of wrapping it up. I'm just going to say, the future of artists. I was just going to say, we used to have comedians who talked politics. Now we have comedians who have become politicians. That's the prime minister of Italy on the left, making a very interesting gesture, and a poet on the top, Brigitte Jónsdóttir from Iceland, who is now involved in politics. And I'm just going to say, aside from revenue streams, there is definitely a way for artists to, even if we're not making the same money that we did from the same kinds of revenue streams, to have impact in the regular world, I guess I would say.
I'm despite the drawbacks that we've discussed, I'm actually very encouraged by this because I think once you have a voice, anything's possible, right? So despite the problems with obscurity and the possible funding issues, you got to have step one. You've got to have the opportunity to create and share your stuff. And we're getting closer and closer to that as we move forward, and I think that's the best thing about it, really.
Yeah, there's opportunity, and yet things are, the playing field is ever changing, but still the people who do something really good because they believe in it are necessary, and I think we'll figure out a way to keep them alive. I don't think people will let that die because it's important to them.
Right.
That's my final thought.
Awesome. One last question, really quick for you guys. What's your favorite content?
My favorite content, it's like in publishing or just
Anywhere.
anything? Wow. Well, my favorite book is White Noise by Don DeLillo, so I guess I'd go with that.
Sure, absolutely. I tweeted a little while ago under the hashtag Arts Thinking and with a second hashtag, my artists, a list of artists that I like, but one of them is an Israeli DJ called Cootie Man, who became famous a few years ago because when he had a broken leg and couldn't move for months at a time, got obsessed with YouTube videos and chopping them up and turning them into music. So he made music and music videos out of something
cool.
that never existed, and people that played in, as an orchestra and music that had never met each other.
Interesting.
Cootie
That's
Man
cool.
with a K.
All right. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks very much for having us.
Thanks, guys.